Okay, so, picture this. You don't just react when a crisis hits, you're ahead of it. You're playing out every what-if scenario, making sure everyone's got a plan and stays safe. That's the emergency response coordinator life. High stakes, big responsibility, and today we're going deep on it with RoleCatcher's Guide. We're talking risk analysis, the unexpected skills you need. It's gonna be good. But first, what are we talking about exactly? Someone says, emergency response coordinator, give me the quick version.
Okay, so imagine this. You've got potential disasters, natural ones, accidents on the job, even health scares that affect everyone. You're building the game plan to handle it all before it goes down.
So it's not just knowing what to do when the alarm's blaring, it's making sure the alarm barely even needs to exist.
Exactly. It's all about lowering the chances of something bad happening and making sure everyone's ready if it does. Could be for a whole company, a community, even a city. Way more proactive than people think.
Makes sense. You can't just be reactive, gotta think ahead. But the guide mentions high stress, dangerous situations.
Not for the faint of heart, right? Yeah, it's demanding, gotta be honest. RoleCatcher doesn't try to hide that, but here's the thing. Alongside that, they highlight huge job satisfaction.
Because you're actually making a difference, right? That's gotta feel good. Especially when things are rough, not just numbers, it's about people's lives.
Exactly. There's a story, right, about a coordinator who helps a coastal town get ready for a hurricane. They're setting up evacuation routes, shelters, getting all the first responders on the same page. And the storm hits hard, causes a lot of damage, but because of their planning, no one dies. That's the kind of impact that stays with you.
Wow, that's heavy. So what do you need to even get into this kind of work? Is it all like disaster simulations and first aid?
Here's where it gets interesting. The backgrounds they list, they're all over the place. Some emergency management, sure, but also psychology, sociology, even geography.
Psychology, that's a curveball. What's the link there?
Well, when a crisis happens, knowing how people react is just as key as, say, putting out a fire. You got to predict how they'll behave under pressure, know how to talk to them when things are chaotic, and offer support in a way that makes sense for different people.
So it's not just the logistics, it's the human side of it too. Hard skills and people skills.
Exactly. And the guide goes beyond just, degrees or whatever. They talk about core abilities, things like complex problem solving, critical thinking, being able to learn on the fly.
So even without some specific emergency management degree, you might already have the basics down. That's pretty encouraging, actually.
Totally. These aren't talents you're born with. They're things you build over time. Think about it. In your own life, you solve problems every day. You adapt to new info. You make choices when things are hectic. Those are valuable anywhere, but especially in this field.
It's like having a preparedness mindset at work and just in life. But how has that become an actual career? What are the steps to becoming an emergency response coordinator?
They break it down into stages, which is really helpful, right? It's not this vague, work your way up. You see the actual rungs on the ladder.
Give us the sneak peek then. What are some of those stages?
So you might start as like an assistant, right? Helping out with things like risk analysis. The guide talks about someone at this level. They're researching potential problems at a manufacturing plant. Could be chemical spills, fire hazards, even cybersecurity stuff. Learning the basics, getting that core knowledge.
Really hands-on, figuring out how to spot those risks. What's next after that?
As you get better, you might become a junior coordinator. More responsibility now. You're actually building those emergency response plans. There's a part where a junior coordinator designs an entire evacuation for a big office building where people gather, how to contact everyone, even making sure it works for people with disabilities.
So they're not just spotting problems anymore, but actually coming up with solutions. That's a big jump. What about those massive decisions, the ones affecting whole communities? When do those come into play?
That's senior coordinator territory. Those are the folks who've pretty much seen it all, years of experience, and yeah, they're making the calls that affect entire communities, organizations, the whole 9 yards.
Makes sense, like the guide said earlier, clear path, more responsibility as you go. But reading about it's one thing, actually doing it. What surprised you about the day-to-day when you were going through the guide?
Honestly, the sheer variety, the different people you got to work with. One minute you're looking at weather data, the next you're leading a training for volunteers, then it's a meeting with government officials about resources. It's a lot.
Sounds like you can't be afraid to switch gears constantly. Definitely not a desk job.
No way. And the tech side of it really stood out too. It's not just like walkie-talkies and sirens anymore.
Now we're talking. Give us the techie details. What kind of tools are we talking about?
Think software that helps you analyze risk, like actually mapping out where floods might hit, or simulating earthquakes. Then there's stuff to help build those response plans, contacts, communication trees, figuring out resources, and of course, social media, apps. That's huge for getting the word out during a crisis.
So you got to be a bit of a tech person on top of everything else.
It's always changing, which I think is cool. And speaking of changing, they talk about how drones are becoming a bigger and bigger deal.
Drones. Now that's interesting. How are they being used?
Well, they're amazing for search and rescue, especially after natural disasters. They can cover a huge area fast, even dangerous places, find missing people way quicker than ground teams. Also good for checking damage, delivering supplies, even giving real-time info to the people on the ground.
That's wild, like something out of a movie. It's amazing how tech's changing disaster response.
It really is. But here's the thing. No matter how fancy the tech gets, this job is about people, understanding them, knowing how they'll act, and keeping them safe in crazy situations. That's where those people skills come back, in communication, empathy, connecting with all kinds of people.
Like the guide said, service orientation is key for these coordinators. Not just having answers, but genuinely wanting to help, especially when people are at their most vulnerable.
Exactly. And that ties into another thing they emphasize, making decisions, especially when the pressure's on.
Because in an emergency, you don't always have time to check the rule book or get everyone to agree. Sometimes you just got to make the call.
Right. And they highlight ethical conduct there. You're dealing with people's lives, entire communities, weighing risks of benefits fast, making the best call you can with what you've got, even if the info's not perfect.
That's intense. Any examples in the guide of those tough ethical calls that coordinators face?
So there's this scenario, right? An emergency response coordinator, they got to decide if they evacuate a whole town, coastal town, hurricane's coming. Problem is, the forecast is iffy, could be a near miss, could be a direct hit. Evacuating, that's thousands of people, logistics nightmare, and if the storm veers off, people are going to be mad, there's economic fallout, the whole deal. But if they don't evacuate and the storm hits,
That's the nightmare scenario. What did they end up doing?
they made the call to evacuate. Safety first, even with the risk of backlash. Turns out hurricane changed course, minimal damage, and yeah, people question their judgment.
I bet. Second guessing after the fact is easy. But sounds like they did what they thought was best with the info they had, which is all you can really do.
Exactly. And the guide really drives that home. Those judgment calls, they come with the territory. It's not always clear-cut. Sometimes you're working with incomplete information, making the best of it. Experience matters. Having strong ethics matters. That's huge in this line of work.
Having the guts to make the tough call when it counts, and then living with the outcome. But even with all that, the guide still talks about how rewarding this career is. Why do you think that is?
You're making a real difference, you know? It's not just pushing paper, going to meetings. You're out there protecting people, keeping communities safe. That's got to mean something.
Knowing your work has an impact, that it really matters. Speaking of which, for anyone listening who's thinking, this sounds like me, what's the first step? Didn't RoleCatcher have some resources about this?
Oh yeah, they have a whole getting started section, super practical advice. One of the best things, honestly, is get some experience. They suggest volunteering, maybe with local emergency management or like the Red Cross.
That's smart. You get a feel for the work, meet people in the field, and you're helping out while you learn.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be like a full-time thing. Even a few hours a month gives you insights, builds skills. They also mention online courses, certifications, that kind of thing, in emergency management or related stuff. Tons of options now. Many are free or pretty cheap.
That's great to hear. So you don't need to, like, quit your job and go back to school to even dip your toes in. Start small, see if it's a good fit.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And honestly, even if you don't end up being an emergency response coordinator, those skills translate. Thinking critically, solving problems under pressure, communicating well, those are valuable anywhere.
Couldn't agree more. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. What sticks with me is that being prepared isn't just about making it through a disaster, it's about stopping it before it even happens. And that takes a special kind of person, the knowledge, the skills, but also really wanting to help others.
Perfectly said. Makes you think, what risks are we ignoring in our own lives? What could we be doing right now to be a little more ready?
Something to ponder. Until next time, everyone, stay curious and stay safe.